Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for the 7th of 8 Energy Symposium webinars hosted by the UAF Alaska Center for Energy and Power. My name is Rochelle Johnson, and I'm the lead analyst at the University of Alaska Center for Economic Development and co-lead for the Alaska Nuclear Energy Working Group, and I will be your facilitator today. The purpose of these events is to present topic-specific information to the Alaska Energy Security Task Force as they work to develop a statewide energy plan. If you missed the first 6 webinars, the recordings are available via the link on the task force website. Today's presentation is Emerging Technologies and the Opportunities for Alaska, Small-Scale Nuclear. We are joined today by Gwen Holdman from ASEP, Mark Nickel from the Nuclear Energy Institute, and Travis Millian from Copper Valley Electric Association. Each presentation is allotted 40 minutes, which includes a 10-minute Q&A. As these presentations are intended to inform the task force, only task force members will be able to unmute and verbally ask questions if they raise their hands. All webinar attendees will be able to submit questions through the Q&A box on your webinar screen. However, please note that we will be prioritizing questions from the task force members. Today's meeting is being recorded, and the presentation slide decks will be available on the task force page on AEA's website. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, Travis Millian with Copper Valley Electric Association. Travis is the CEO of CVEA, at least until the end of today. He brings 20 plus years of experience in the power systems and electric utility industry. Over the last couple of years, CVEA has been exploring the potential for installing small-scale nuclear generation on CVEA's grid, and Travis is going to tell us a little bit more about that. Travis, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I'll get my screen shared for us, and we'll get going. All right. So as you'll see here, this particular slide deck is talking about ultra-safe nuclear, but that's only because that's who we partnered with to do a feasibility study. Copper Valley Electric, we're kind of unbiased either way on the technology. We did talk to a number of the different manufacturers out there before landing on ultra-safe to perform our feasibility study. So everything that we talk about through this process and the feasibility study was specific for the project we were looking at. But Copper Valley is indifferent to the different manufacturers. And like I said, we talked to at least 4 or 5 different manufacturers through this process. So we're going to go over a little bit today on an overview on why Copper Valley Electric started looking into micromodular reactors. Going to go into the details of the feasibility study and the results with that, and kind of what our steps are, or what our steps were to conclude the study. So in 2021, the CVA Board of Directors developed a updated strategic plan for the cooperative. And of that, there were 5 goals that were established. And one of the goals was to develop a plan to reduce the use of diesel fuel. We've got a unique situation for Copper Valley Electric, where we're an isolated grid in interior Alaska. We serve from our corporate headquarters in Glen Allen down the Richardson Highway to Valdez, and we've got a very vast service territory, about 160 miles north and south by 100 miles east and west. But because we're electrically isolated, we do all of our own generation, transmission, and distribution on our system. We are blessed in the summertime to have a lot of hydro generation. Currently today, we're 100% hydro, and we typically are throughout the summer months. But as our hydro plants start freezing up and the rainfall turns into snow, we have to back off our hydro plants. One of them comes offline for the entire winter. And the second one, we've got a lake in Valdez, Solomon Lake, that we have to utilize that lake and that water throughout the entire winter. So we get about 25 to 30% of our total generation needs out of hydro in the wintertime, but everything else has to be made up using diesel fuels. One of the things we've seen over the years, and has always been a problem that we've been trying to solve, is The increased fuel costs, as you can see at the graph on the right-hand side, just in a 14-month period of time, we saw over 125% increase in fuel costs. And these fuel costs are just the cost of fuel it takes for us to generate electricity with either our diesel plants or our cogeneration project. These costs are passed through on a month-to-month basis directly to our members. And so our members see this vast increase in fluctuation in costs between our summertime and our wintertime rates. In fact, our summertime rates typically are about 19 cents a kilowatt hour to the meter. And last winter, we were seeing rates spike as high as 42 cents a kilowatt hour in the middle of the winter. So we're trying to find a way to stabilize the winter rates over a long duration and also take away that fluctuation. Also trying to look at a way to reduce the amount of emissions that we're putting out from our fossil fuel plants. And overall, I mean, we've looked at a number of different options before looking at the MMR technology. We've studied wind in our service territory. Unfortunately, the best wind we saw is a marginal class 2, which is not good for a commercial wind operation. Solar could work in the interior parts of Alaska where our service territory is, but unfortunately, the best time for that is in the summer, and we've already got more than enough hydro capacity in the summertime. We've looked at geothermal, biomass, additional hydro assets within our area. And then obviously we've looked into the road belt intertie to interconnect to the rail belt as a possible solution. So we've looked at a number of different things. This was just something that, again, another option that CVA was exploring. Back in early 2020, our board unanimously decided to let's start pursuing the MMR technology more and find out what we can discover for solutions in our service territory. So at that point in time is when we started talking to the various manufacturers. One of the misconceptions we saw throughout this entire process was that people were really confused on really what MMR technology was and wasn't. What a lot of people thought anytime you mentioned nuclear is they were thinking the standard light water reactors that are used in the current fleet in the United States, which are very large scale facilities. So what I'm showing here is just a graphical representation of what kind of the landmass that's needed for a light water reactor versus the landmass needed for an MMR. Again, we were working with USNC. Their particular project we were looking at was about a 10 megawatt electric unit that took up about 5 acres of land. So quite a bit smaller, about the size of 2 football fields. And that's just being represented here in this graphic. The other part that we recognize as well as people were really confused within our communities on how big your reactor building would be. And so the graphic showing the red cylindrical spot in the middle of the light water system is the reactor building. And we had to zoom in on the yellow spot in the middle, which is about the size of a Connex that's mounted vertically into the ground on how big the reactor building is on the MMR. So quite a bit smaller than a traditional reactor. This slide's just talking a little bit about the technology, but what I want to point out is what we were looking at is this graph on the middle on the right-hand side. So it would have 2 reactor buildings giving us 10 megawatts of electric energy and a total of 30 megawatts of thermal. So the purpose of our feasibility study and what we were wanting to look at and discover was, was there anything that would prevent us from siting a micromodular reactor within the CVA service territory? We wanted to identify preferred sites and locations and what those characteristics would be. Start looking at what the cost parameters would be in order to make a good decision point going forward. For a cost comparison on, we figured going in that there was no way that, especially the first of a kind coming out would be able to beat our hydro prices, but we were pretty certain that we could beat our diesel fuel prices. Obviously, we're looking at what our benefits were, what the concerns of the communities and issues of the communities in our area were having. And then to take it a step further, as we contracted with UltraSafe to do the feasibility study, we wanted to have a third-party independent consultant taking a look at this information as well. And so we contracted with an Alaska-based company electric power systems to kind of spot check the information. They're a company that's well known throughout the state of Alaska. They do a lot of work on the electric utility industry and have done a lot of work with us. So we just wanted some third-party credibility in addition to the work that CVA and USNC were doing on this project. So what I'm showing here is just kind of a timeline of the feasibility study and that we went through. So we made an announcement in February of 2022 that we were going to move forward with a feasibility study looking at the MMR technology for the CVA system. Prior to that, we actually went and met with our congressional delegation back in Washington, D.C. in November of 2021, just to give them a heads up and let them know that we were looking into this so that if any of their constituents were to reach out to them, they weren't blindsided by it. At the same time, we reached out to the governor's office, and then in January, we had went and met with our state delegation and discussed this with them as well. Again, we didn't want to blindside any of our legislative folks. So from basically March until the first part of October, the study was being developed. We received the draft copy of the report in October. And then our board discussed the results of that report during our October board meeting. We needed a little bit more additional information to finalize it, including some internal economic analysis to be done. And then that was completed and performed in December of 2022. And then we met again with the board in January of 2023 to determine next steps. A different approach we decided to take with this was to get out in front of this early. Normally, if we were looking at some sort of a generation project, we would go through, do your feasibility study, maybe start going in and doing field studies. And then once we had the results of that, then we would go out public and start talking to our membership about the potential of the project. But because anytime you mention the word nuclear, there's mixed emotions with it, we wanted to get out early and often with our membership. So as soon as we made the public announcement, we started holding public meetings in our service territory. Even though we knew there would be a lot of questions that would come up that we didn't have answers to, we thought this was a prime opportunity to find out what the issues or concerns were that our members were having and figure out ways to address those or at least educate on those things. So during that time, we went around, had public meetings both in Glen Allen and Valdez. We met with the Valdez City Council. We had multiple trips back to Washington, D.C. and to Juneau, and just had a lot of stakeholder engagement throughout the entire feasibility study process. So, there's a few things that came up, and the thing that we continuously heard over and over again, besides the fact, like I said, there was some misconception on what the MMR technology was and what the MMR technology was not. And besides that, the thing that we heard over and over again from any people who were concerned was safety issues, environmental impact, and waste disposal. And so what we were able to do then is as we were having additional meetings going forward, is we were able to tailor the presentation to address these issues. And so we could discuss the safety related elements within the design of the fuel for the particular reactor we were looking at. Same type of thing with the environmental impacts. The waste disposal was addressed, and I know there's a number of different manufacturers who have said the same thing, to where a lot of people in Alaska are concerned on the waste being stored or kept in Alaska for any length of time. And I know UltraSafe and some other manufacturers we've talked to have already said publicly that they would be responsible for taking the waste and getting it out of the state, and then they would be responsible for storing that waste. So as we continued to have these conversations and address these issues and educate on these issues, we really saw a pretty large acceptance of the technology. We probably saw greater than 80% of our members being supportive of looking into this technology further to solve our wintertime energy issues. Obviously, you still get a group of people that are anti or they're against it. But some of them, you're just never going to change their mind. But we were very impressed to see that there was such a large percentage of people that were really keenly supportive and interested in the technology. So as we were going through the feasibility study, as I'd mentioned, we were looking at various locations on where we could potentially site a location. What we found really quickly is there was no spot within Glen Allen that would make sense. We looked at a couple spots near our existing transmission substations, but the biggest thing we determined with the feasibility study is that because we have so much hydro, especially in the summertime, we would only be displacing about 15% of our total generation needs. The downfall is your peak that you would need to cover in the wintertime is fairly high, but your overall capacity is pretty low throughout the entire year. So really the unit would only get about a 15% capacity factor, which makes it very, very difficult to make a generation project work. So we recognized early on that we would have to find a heat off-taker in order to make this economical. So really quickly, we determined there was no such off-taker in the Copper Basin, so that site was eliminated. We looked at 4 different spots in Valdez, and the picture you're looking at here is looking at the Port of Valdez in the middle. The upper part is the city of Valdez. And down below, there's a number of squares, the Petrostar Refinery, our Solomon Gulch Power Plant, the Valdez Marine Terminals over on the left-hand side of the bottom, kind of gives you a layout of the land. This particular map is actually the tsunami inundation zone for this area in Valdez. So there's a few different sites we looked at, in particular on the right-hand side, the Richardson site, which has got a blue arrow pointed to it, and the Harris site with a blue arrow. Both of those fell within the tsunami inundation zone, and so we wanted to avoid that as much as possible. So we found that there were 2 sites that were pretty feasible to locate. The first is on the kind of the middle left-hand side, next to the sign that says the Petrostar Switch Building, called the Mountain Site. So that is up above tidewater quite a ways. It's up on a hillside, outside the tsunami inundation zone, and it's within about a mile or less of our existing infrastructure. So it could be integrated into our system pretty easily. The other one is on the bottom right, and that's right next to our transmission substation, the Meal substation. Would be a good location, again, outside the tsunami inundation zone, near our infrastructure. However, this particular site would have a lot of ground prep in order to make it work. So in reality, we were looking that the Mountain site would probably be the best location to locate this, and it was near other industrial facilities that could potentially be looked at as heat off-takers. So as we were looking at this again for Copper Valley Electric's situation, essentially what we were evaluating was we knew we would still we'd have our hydro we wouldn't be able to displace. We'd be able to displace some of our diesel, but primarily we wanted to look at what it would take to displace our cogeneration project that's currently our wintertime workhorse. And so what this graph is showing is this is our normal output of our cogeneration plant. So pretty much you can see it comes online in about December, runs till May, and then is shut off. We produce the electricity out of that plant right now at about 5.5 megawatts, and then we actually sell exhaust heat over to the Petrostar Refinery as part of our agreement with them. And so what we saw really quickly is that the capacity factor was so low in this scenario that running it for electric only would just not be economical. So the next scenario we looked at was, well, is there a way that we could do the electric, which is in red, during that same time period, and then just somehow figure out a way if you could get a heat off-taker to have a constant amount of heat being transmitted at all times. And that turned out to be somewhat economical. It was pretty marginal at that point, but it had some potential. And then the last scenario we looked at was, well, let's try to see about maximizing the heat output from the unit year-round, and then just blend in the electric when needed. And it quickly came to the conclusion that as long as you had a heat off-taker for a project like this under Copper Valley scenario, it could be very economical. We found that it would It would definitely beat our current fuel generation portfolio. Obviously, it would not be able to beat our hydro because that's a very low cost generation source, but it could work out very well. And so going forward, what we definitely found was there were suitable site locations for Copper Valley that would work out very well. This technology could be easily integrated into our current electrical system. The thing that was a benefit that we saw, especially with the MMR technology, is that you could utilize it similar to like a battery, to where you could bring the unit on and off. You didn't have to have the unit on at all times, which could extend the life of the unit. But from our case, is because you would have to have a heat off taker in order to make it economical. The unit had to be ran, throughout the year. Again, as I had mentioned, the public acceptance was very positive within our service territory. We feel that the approach that we took to get out front and start educating and holding public meetings early really benefited on that. I've seen some studies as well that have shown pretty much what we saw, that you have a small percentage that will be against it, another fairly small percentage that are completely supportive of it, and then there's a big percentage that are really in the middle, that really have not came to a conclusion one way or the another if they're supportive or against it. And what we found is, with the proper education, a lot of people really can get behind it and support it. So what our board determined after we discussed in December of 2022 or in January of 23 is that there were so many variables with the economics. Primarily is we were looking at various grant funding to help support this. There was tax rebates that went into it potentially. But ideally, we saw that a partnership with the manufacturer was the thing that could really make this work. But because of the other parts with the grant funding and the tax payments, we just saw that it was too much risk for CVEA to own and operate the reactor, and for our members to own that. So we moved forward and started discussing with UltraSafe regarding a power purchase agreement for long-term energy with them. And again, like I mentioned, the thing to really make that economical would be a long-term heat off-taker in our situation. And unfortunately, USNC was unable to secure an off-taker for the long duration. They were hopeful they could make it work, but unfortunately, again, because of our particular situation, it just couldn't work. And so we just determined about a month ago, came out with a press release that unfortunately we're not going to be moving forward with the project at this point in time. But we felt that the evaluation that we went through and the process we went through was very beneficial for CVA's members. And the way I've always looked at it too is, if the work that we did on this were to open the door for another utility within the state or another entity to possibly evaluate this technology or to take steps forward with this technology, that was a humongous win for us. So even though Copper Valley right now is not going forward with the project, we feel it was still a very worthwhile and very beneficial. At the end of the day, if something changes and there is a heat off taker that is interested, that could change the scenario and this could be brought back up again. So some of the other conclusions with this, and these are, my kind of more personal opinion, not necessarily the opinion of Copper Valley. But as I said before, with the proper education, we find that a lot of people are very supportive of this technology. I feel this technology could work in a number of different Alaska communities, particularly those that are highly dependent on diesel and that don't have other options like hydro to kind of get them through the summertime. So if it was running at a higher capacity factor, that's going to drive the economics down quite a bit. Again, if you can find a heat off taker, that'd be good. But I really think an economy of scale, if there was a way that whether multiple utilities or the state or somebody could pull in and purchase a number of these, that would help drive the cost down, especially with these earlier units being not mass manufactured yet, the price naturally is going to be higher. But if there's a way to partner up and find a way to buy a number of these to drive that cost down, and then figure out where throughout the state it makes sense to start deploying these, I think that's going to help make this a lot more economical going forward. So with that, that is my final slide right now, and I'd be happy to take any questions that anybody has, Rochelle.
Thank you, Travis. We are open for questions. I will prioritize questions from the task force members. If you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll unmute you. If you are not a task force member and you still have a question, feel free to drop those in the chat or the Q&A box, and we can get to those. Any questions from our attendees? I am not seeing anything, so you might have gotten off the hook easy, Travis.
All right.
Oh, I did see one. There we are. They're coming in. So first, Jeff Round asks, did CVA work with economic development organizations to crack issues like heat off-takers? What types of organizations would benefit from partnering with CVA to drive local sort of energy economic development opportunities?
Yeah, so primarily what we did is we actually early on started reaching out to the known industrial entities within our service territory, particularly in Valdez, to find out if there was a need or desire, if we could find a way to produce heat and provide heat over to them. And so we were focusing with known entities. We knew of a couple other potentials that had been talked about coming to town that could utilize the heat. And I know they were quite interested in that opportunity. But again, it was one of those that there was no solid commitment that they were actually going to be moving into Valdez and they could sign any sort of long-term agreement or anything at that point in time. And so we got a little bit, into the chicken and egg situation to where, if you build it, they will come. And we didn't want to take that kind of risk. And that was a big thing for us. I know locally, there's conversations even within like the city of Valdez of, is there some other opportunities outside of existing entities that could take advantage of this? Is there something that maybe the city could utilize that heat for? And so there's some hurdles that way that need to be still looked at. But from a state perspective, we really didn't go down that road. I don't know if USNC reached out to any of the state departments or anything like that. I know they were more looking at a global statewide outreach for some of the public acceptance and discussions, but I'm not sure if it went further into like the Department of Commerce or not.
Thank you. So we got a question from Carl Hanneman, and he asks, what is the range of CapEx for the units? Is that information publicly available?
I can tell you that from USNC standpoint, that's not readily available at this point in time. I know a few of the other manufacturers have told me kind of what they're looking at as well, but I have not seen publicly where any of the CapEx total dollars are in. Everything that's been public, and I think Mark will touch on this in his presentation some, is more of a range of cost per kilowatt hour. And for us, one of the things we saw for sure was because of that partnership we were looking to get into, as opposed to just buying a unit from a manufacturer, that's where we had a lot of negotiation options in order to drive that cost down. So I do know some of the CapEx ranges, but I know they're not public at this point.
Fair. Thank you. So next, I think you did answer this early in your presentation, but maybe we could cover it again. We had a question in the chat that since you're not pursuing nuclear right now, what other types of technologies are you looking into?
Yeah. So as I'd mentioned in the presentation, we've looked at wind, we've looked at solar, biomass has been brought up in the interior part of our region before. We've looked at geothermal because we've got a few, potential geothermal areas, but it just wasn't high enough heat for what we would need. Really, right now, what we're looking at is we've got a project that we're going forward with interconnecting to the Valdez Marine Terminal, and with that project, it's looking that we're going to start displacing quite a bit of diesel with the power exchange agreement we have going with them. So, really, the thing we're looking on right now is we've evaluated raising our spillway or our reservoir at the Solomon Gulch project in the past, but in the past, based on our load profile and everything, we could only fill that reservoir up about 25% of the time. So with this new project going forward, it looks like we're going to have additional water resources that we wouldn't normally have because of this, and we might be able to raise it at that point. So that's really kind of where our focus is at right now. I mean, nuclear is still right on the forefront. I mean, if anything changes, we would love to see that happen, but until that time, we're not stopping. We're trying to find a way to solve that wintertime energy issue, and we think some of our existing facilities might be the way to do it at this point.
Like all utilities, you have a lot of balls in the air.
Yes, we do.
Do we have any other questions from attendees or from task force members? Okay, seeing nothing, thank you, Travis, for your presentation. Very, very much. We will now move on to our next presentation. We have Mark Nickel with the Nuclear Energy Institute. Mark joined NEI in 2011 and is the executive director of New Nuclear. In this role, he leads the industry's efforts to improve policy, regulatory affairs, and the business environment for new and advanced reactors. Mark will be presenting on the state of microreactors. Mark, the floor is yours.
All right, great, thanks. Let me check. I might have shared my screen on accident. Are you seeing the screen, or are you seeing the presentation?
We are seeing the screen.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Not sure how that happened.
There, you're good.
There you go. All right, well, thank you. Yeah, appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm going to cover general matters, the technology, and especially do a deep dive into costs. So those previous questions were really good from this perspective, and I'll just dive right into it. Looking at the microreactor technology, there are a number of different companies developing designs. At one point, we had counted over 15 companies developing designs. The companies listed here are the more significant ones that are developing, especially the ones at the top with pictures. They are further along in development. But generally, and I know we got a flavor of this from the last presentation, what characterizes microreactor technologies really is their very small size. And I think Travis did a great job in showing you the size compared to large reactors. So I won't restate that, but size is really the advantage here. Given that they're intended to be replacements to large diesel generators that you might see in very remote areas, whether it's remote villages or mining operations or things like that. The other thing that characterizes microreactor technology is their resilience and reliability. Their nuclear energy itself is developed to be very robust. We have to be able to meet the high safety standards that's set by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And so that means designing them tough to be able to withstand different natural phenomenon, whether it be earthquakes or tornadoes, hurricanes. I know you don't get some of those in Alaska, but it just goes to show what they're designed for. They're also designed to withstand significant man-made physical and cyber threats because the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has high standards for those, and so they are protected against them. The third thing that characterizes microreactor technology is in the operations. They're in terms of being different than other nuclear facilities. And because of their small size, they're much simpler. Their safety systems are much simpler, rely much more on natural physics like gravity and natural circulation. And this is really conducive to what we call automatic operations, where you can use feedback from the system to be able to help adjust power in the reactor. It's able to shut itself down. You can operate it in island mode, which means it's completely self-contained, independent of a larger grid, as well as black start. So if you do have multiple generation assets on the grid, then this could be the first one to start power and help the others come on board. And then there's a lot of flexibility being designed in these. Like all nuclear energy, it produces high temperatures and a lot of heat. And so that heat can be used directly, or more traditionally, it's converted into electricity. But we could also use it to generate hydrogen as well. And they're being designed with much more flexible operations. So whether it's changing from one of those energy products to another, heat to hydrogen, for example, or if it's just being ramped up and down to integrate better with renewables. And we can talk about some of the economic implications to those as well. The system benefits of advanced reactors are largely the benefits of nuclear energy generally. Long-term price stability, because we're a high capital cost, but a very low fuel and operating cost technology. Readily dispatchable. I talked about the resilience and reliability. So it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Now, one of the differences with microreactors is that current nuclear energy has to refuel every 18 months or 2 years. Microreactors are being developed so they can go between refuelings 5, 10, 20 years, possibly even longer. So they are much easier to be able to be located in a site and then not have to transport much to that site for future maintenance. It's all really self-contained for a very long time. Talked about integration with renewables. The use of transmission is much more efficient for nuclear energy generally, just because of our energy density. And so not only is it the land utilization, but more importantly, the efficient use of transmission as well. I think by now most everybody knows nuclear energy is zero carbon emissions, but we're also one of the lowest total carbon footprints of any source. I think we're tied for the lowest with wind. And we're also being designed, especially the microreactors, for what's called dry air cooling. So they don't need a local body of water as an ultimate heat sink. And I talked about the black start capabilities. Talking a little bit about the heat use, this is just a representation of all the different types of industrial processes that you may use, high temperature, steam, or air for manufacturing, and a relative identification of the temperatures. Some advanced reactors operate at higher temperatures than others. What we're hearing is that even those processes that might be a little bit higher than what the output of the microreactor would be, that it's very simple and cost effective to be able to boost that with electrical heaters to be able to get to even higher temperatures. And so really all of these potential heat uses are all within range of what a nuclear microreactor would be able to produce. And looking long range at very remote areas, you can start to imagine future scenarios where not only is the microreactor providing that electricity, it can produce district heating. So it can provide heating that's piped throughout the local village to provide heat directly. to decarbonize heat generation for homes and other things. It could also be used to produce whether it's hydrogen for hydrogen vehicles or electric vehicles, or ammonia for different things. I know Department of Defense has talked recently about the promise of technology that would be able to produce jet fuel just by using energy in the air. And so there's a lot of opportunities that a microreactor could really be self-contained to really decarbonize all energy needs in a particular location. That brings us to the market opportunities or applications for this, and I'll divide it into stationary and mobile. Looking at the stationary, we have these would be microreactors that are in place for their entire lifetime, 20 years, 40 years, or longer. And those are remote villages and other things. Now, in terms of that lifetime, I talked about the fuel life, which could be 5, 10, 20 years, or even longer. But the business approaches that people are starting to think about for microreactors is that they would almost be like batteries, where you would bring one in, it would operate for its fuel lifetime. So the fuel might be, let's say, 10 years. And then you would come in and swap it out for a different microreactor that has new fuel in it. And then after that microreactor that you had there first cools off, then you could remove it from site, including its used fuel, take it back to a factory and refurbish and refuel it there. So the used fuel wouldn't stay at the operating location. It would be taken away after a cooling period. And then that reactor vessel can operate, for longer. That's why you would refuel it. But that site itself, because it's continuing to get refreshed with a battery every, say, 10 years, it would be licensed for 40 years initially. But what we're finding with today's reactors is that they've been relicensed for 60 years. The NRC is going through a process to relicense them even longer, up to 80 years. And so these are really, really long duration assets. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the capital costs, which, but as you look at it in terms of the longevity, those capital costs really start to make more sense. There are a number of projects being planned in the United States. These include not just microreactor projects, but also grid scale projects. And so you're aware of the ones in Alaska, but the microreactor projects to talk about in some other states are really for universities. And so we see the University of Illinois is pursuing a microreactor for heat and power, as well as Penn State, Abilene Christian University, and some others. And so university is really one key application for this. The other thing that's interesting is we look at some of these states, and especially states that are connected to the grid but have rural locations far from generation source. We call them, I'd call them, far from downstream on the transmission line. What they're finding is that they have a lot of resilience and reliability challenges because they're far from the generation. And so some of those states are talking about, well, what if we put a microreactor at the end of the line, transmission line, to really boost the resilience and reliability? So while in the past we've largely talked about microreactors for very remote areas like Alaska, northern Canada, there is actually talk about doing projects in the continental states. In fact, Oklo, one of the microreactor companies, is the DOT in Ohio, southern Ohio, looking to build 2 microreactors there, and we're expecting them to announce their off-takers sometime in the near future. This is a list of all those projects. I went through the ones that went through some of them. We can come back to questions on this if you want to know more, but otherwise I won't go through the details now. When we look at advanced reactor licensing progress, this is an indicator of maturity and commercialization, because everybody has to go through the regulatory process. There are a number of microreactors that are going through that process. Abilene Christian University is under review now. Some of those others that I mentioned are in what we call pre-application. So they are interacting with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and they're preparing to submit an application to the NRC. In terms of thinking about microreactors, there's a lot of information about that in terms of how you do resource planning. The one I want to focus on here is cost. So I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth on cost, but I just wanted to put this slide there to show that there's a lot of considerations that you need to go through, and the one I'm about to discuss is just one of the many considerations. So when we look at cost, NEI did a paper, it's back in 2019, which I recognize is a few years old now, and after I go through the results from that earlier paper, I'll talk about what the current situation in 2023 implies for that. But we did a cost analysis on microreactors and tried to compare them against diesel generators in a number of markets. And so first, in terms of estimating diesel generator costs, we looked only at the fuel cost. We decided not to take in the depreciation of the capital cost. We figured that's already been paid for essentially and built in. So, swapping it out for a microreactor isn't really the thought process, because we're really looking at replacing installed diesel generators, not a question of whether a new generation should be diesel or micro. So we did not include capital. Also did not include O&M. We recognized those costs would increase it, but we looked and said, well, let's just try to be as conservative as possible here in this cost analysis. And the fuel prices we had ranged from $2.86 a gallon to $4.89. For the microreactor cost, we sourced the cost inputs from the microreactor developers. And so we have a range of cost inputs that are in that report that's referenced here. Everything from the overnight capital cost to the fixed and maintenance operations and maintenance cost, fuel cost, and decommissioning, as well as that refueling, which is basically the swapping out of the fuel that I talked about earlier. And we used a couple of assumptions that it was a 10-year fuel life, a 40-year plant life, a 95% capacity factor. And so those go into it as well. You can see here the overall conclusions. I'm going to go into some detail on some of what's under the hood here. But the overall conclusions is that, for in most cases, a microreactor could be lower cost than the installed diesel generator. And so while every decision is project specific, it does go to show that a microreactor is at least something that people should be considering. This is a summary of different cost estimates for the market prices, current market prices, and the cost estimates for the microreactors. So there's a little bit of complexity here I'll walk through. The different color lines, the red, purple, blue, represent our cost estimates. We had a nominal, and then we had a high and low range. And so the blue line was the lowest cost that we were getting. The red was the highest, and so that's why you can see that there. And then what we did is we know that as you continue to build microreactors, the costs will go down because you learn lessons and you get more efficient, and that's why the costs come down. And it's true for every technology, and it's true for nuclear. We've seen it in the past. So we do expect that, but we don't know exactly what that learning rate will be. So we took different assumptions and we said, well, let's have one very conservative, the red one, which means we're going to assume a lower cost reduction based on learning. And then we'll have a very low cost estimate, the more optimistic blue one at the bottom. And we'll have the lowest cost paired with the best rate of cost reduction through learning, and then the middle of the road one. So you can see where that goes. And what this means, because Travis mentioned it earlier, which is What's in the public domain are largely ranges and prices, and there's a reason why we have ranges. One is because every reactor is different, and so some will fall naturally at the lower range, and some will fall at the higher range. And there's a lot that goes into pricing the microreactors. The other is just relative uncertainty. When we did this report, microreactor technologies were relatively early in their cost estimating, and so there was a lot of uncertainty there. So that's why we have the range. The numbers going along the x-axis on the bottom is the number of microreactors deployed. So you can see the first one is going to be the most expensive, and then by the time you get down to number 50, the costs are really stabilized. They're not expecting to go up and down after that. And what it's overlaid, those colored boxes that cross the graph, these are the price ranges, the current market price ranges for generation of the diesel generators that I mentioned through just fuel prices for the different areas. And so we divided Alaska into two. We said, well, there's remote Arctic communities, which generally have a much higher cost basis. And then there's the Alaska Rail Belt, which is a much lower cost basis. And then we did show the US grid there. And then we looked at, well, what about remote defense installations and island communities and remote mining? So we have those. And what it goes to show is that even at the highest cost, there are going to be some places where microreactors are the most cost effective. But if it's the very highest cost, it's not everywhere, but there are some. If we are able to achieve the lowest costs, then microreactors are going to be cost effective in many places, possibly even the Alaska Rail Belt. Approaching the US grid, but as I mentioned earlier, some people are thinking there's a role for it on the US grid, and because it's a small generating asset on a large grid, even if it's a slightly higher cost, it's not really going to impact ratepayers' bills that much. So there's the value of resilience and reliability may really be worth it, even if it's not the lowest levelized cost of electricity. So it may still be chosen. So diving, I've got, I think, two graphs here diving into a little bit of the sensitivity analyses we have in that report. The first one looked at the ownership type. So if you're an investor-owned utility versus a public-owned utility, whether there's a DOE loan guarantee behind it, which, by the way, the DOE does have a lot of loan guarantee authority for these projects. So those are probably the better bars to look at here. But the biggest difference between the investor-owned and the public-owned utility is in the cost of capital, and both in terms of how much debt financing they can do, but also the investor-owned utility has equity financing that they need a higher return on. So those factor in there. And so it does show that, hey, public-owned utilities can probably get a better deal than an investor-owned. Where this, has some consideration is you're looking at the different business models. If you're looking at, well, does the local power electric utility, do they own and operate it, or do they just purchase power from somebody else who owns and operates it? This could be a factor in the decision. Not saying that this should be what drives the decision, but it could be a factor in the decision. We also looked at the sensitivity on how much of a capacity factor the microreactor achieves. So they are able to achieve a 95% or above capacity factor because they are that reliable, resilient generation. But if you were going to integrate them with renewables and flex them up and down in power, and you would just be, say, electricity, and you're not switching that electricity to heat or hydrogen, then you're not operating at full power all the time. And so you get lower capacity factors, which if you're a high capital cost asset, you want to operate it as much as possible because your operating and fuel costs are very, very low. So it does impact the cost. And what we see here, we went all the way down to 45%, which so it's a little less than half the time it's operating. And if you get to there, it's a much higher cost. You might be able to justify it in some situations, especially if it's a piece of your generating portfolio. But for most cases, you're probably not going to want to operate this 45% of the time. However, if you look at something like 75% of the time, you can look at that and say, well, the cost, and I'm just going to take the nominal of 28 cents a kilowatt hour, is not that much more than 23 cents a kilowatt hour. So if you're looking at it as, well, that's that 5 cents is the difference. That's the cost of being able to have a diversified generation portfolio, a microreactor plus renewables, and be able to integrate them in that capacity. It might be something that looks attractive. Finally, looking at the financing of microreactors, and one of the earlier questions was, well, what's the total capital cost? And so we took a 5 megawatt plant as an example, and using the numbers in the report, you get to between $50 and $100 million for the capital cost. That's the upfront capital cost. So, recognizing that could be really significantly high for some, smaller communities that may want this microreactor, and a bit difficult to come up with all that capital up front, although not impossible. There are financing options available. We looked at, well, what are the different options for business models? The conventional business model would be that the local utility finances all that capital cost, typically by debt. As I mentioned, you have lower rates. You can amortize it. There's certain advantages to that. But there's new business models that the industry, and especially the microreactor developers, are working on. And that would be where the developer would own and operate the plant, or they might find a third party that does it, but usually it's a developer. And then they would sell the power to the local utility through a power purchase agreement. The local utility then would not be financing the capital costs. They just pay for the power. So under this one, it doesn't matter if the capital cost is 50 to 100 million, because the utility is only paying on an annual basis, or per service basis for the power. And so they would be seeing the cost in terms of all those dollars per megawatt hour that I was just talking about. The customers, either way, the customer, the ultimate customer that has a bill is going to be seeing it in the same way. The real difference is in how the developer and the local utility bear that financial risk of the project. So looking at another thing, I'm going to speed through some of these slides so we can get to more questions. But going into economics, it really is the workforce, and we're targeting having less than 10 employees total in rural areas. We think we may even be able to get down to just even smaller than a handful. The first plants are likely going to have more employees, just because the NRC is going to have to approve it. And this is a little bit different than what the NRC has experienced before. So they may be overly cautious on the first plants. Nonetheless, we're going to try to work through all of these technology enablers that I have listed here to try to reduce the workforce. One of the things we've heard from very remote communities is that they would like microreactors that don't have that have a smaller, more manageable workforce requirement to them. When we look generally at system planning for electricity, this one modeled the lower 48 grid. But the reason I highlight this is that it's one of the few that I've seen that actually matches demand and supply of electricity on an hour by hour and on a geographic basis. And that really makes a difference, because most studies out there that look at, well, what should our generation portfolio be? They use averages over a year, and they don't really consider the geographic area. And when you do that, you tend to look at, well, what's the lowest cost, levelized cost of electricity, and that's just an average. But what you miss is that you're producing power when people don't need it, and people need power when you're not producing it. And so you don't really get that imbalance in there. And so that's why I like this study. But what it found is that when you do that demand and generation matching, the system really would like to see a lot of nuclear energy on the system. If you rerun the scenario and tell the model that it's constrained on how much nuclear it can have, then what it finds is it'll replace it with other generating sources, and they can still achieve the same carbon reduction. They can still achieve the same reliability, but the cost is much, much higher. So it just goes to show that that nuclear is valuable from the system perspective, and we need to focus more on the system cost and the cost to the customer, and we need to not focus on levelized cost of electricity, which doesn't do all that matching and consideration. The last three slides are all about policy support at the federal, state level, and I'm happy to go through those, but I think the better thing would be to move to questions now and be able to answer those. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. With that, we'll now open the floor for questions. Attendees, once again, you can type into the Q&A, or if you are a task force member, you may raise your hand and ask the question yourself. Sorry, I'm flipping screens so I can make sure. I see we have a question from Keith Kerber, one of our task force members.
Thank you, Rochelle. On one of your last slides, you indicated a mix where it would be 43% nuclear and 50%, I want to say 50% wind and solar to get to the carbon reduction goals by 2050. Do you see what kind of a mix would that nuclear be? I mean, here prior to this time, when we're now talking about the potential for advanced nuclear, all nuclear would be large, like the Vogtle units in Georgia. But within that particular scenario, how much of that do you see being, quote, large or legacy nuclear versus advanced nuclear?
Yeah, good question. So so just to give insight into the numbers, this would be an additional 300 gigawatts of new nuclear. That would be on top of the roughly 100 gigawatts of nuclear that we have today. So 3/4 of all of the nuclear in 2050 would be new advanced reactors. So at least 1/4 will be large. What we're hearing, the model didn't really parse it out, which would be large or small. But what we're hearing is that at least in the near term, most of it is going to be the small modular reactors. And so, this was lower 48. So it's going to be 300 megawatt chunks of plants. But we are hearing that further into the future, probably not before 2040, but after 2040, there's likely going to be a need to go back to the large reactors, at least in some point. So there'll be a mixture of large and small later out as you get closer to 2050. What exact percentage that is, I'm not sure. So, the best thing to say is more than half of all nuclear by 2050 will be advanced.
Rochelle, can I get a follow-up?
Yes, you may.
Thank you. Hey, so thank you for your answer. And there was a great question last night at a meeting in Fairbanks that was looking at the project that's being developed at Eielson Air Force Base. And I'd like to expand it. The question came from Gwen Oldman about timelines for projects. And at your position, do you see timelines looking like they're going to be able to be maintained when it comes to the advanced nuclear actually coming online? I mean, I know that there's projects that are going to be actually, I think, going online at like say INL next year. But those are like the test ones. I'm just curious what you see in terms of actual deployment of the advanced nuclear and what we might be looking at. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're right. The one at INL next year, I think is Marvel. So that's a test one. There's also a demonstration by DoD called Project Pele. That's the mobile version of microreactors, and that's going to be early 2025. Last I heard, it's actually tracked really well with its initial schedule and cost, and it's just a little bit higher. And longer than that, not much. So let me focus more on the SMRs because more of them are, well, they're a little bit further in the process of getting projects underway. Partly that's because the government is cost sharing with some of those. So you've got UAMPS with the NuScale. You've got Dow with X Energy, and you have Pacific Corp with TerraPower, just to name a few. But you also have a non-government funded. You have BWRX 300 with Ontario Power Generation, and so those schedules I know a little bit better just because they've been communicated more often. We expect those schedules to mostly be feasible. There may be things outside of sort of external factors that come to play. So, for example, X Energy has extended their schedule because of HALEU is not readily available. So they've done that. UAMPS has extended their schedule a little bit, not because the technology couldn't be deployed on that schedule, but because their coal power plant closure or retirement was pushed out a little bit, and so they just didn't need the power, and so they were trying to match that. The thing I'll say though is that schedule and cost certainty and the inverse, which is the risk of cost overruns and schedule extensions, are a big concern for industry, and we know that we don't have the best track record, and we're working to improve that. So there's several things that we're trying to do to get better certainty on cost and schedule. The first is inherent to the technology itself, because it's simpler by design and it's smaller. More of the construction can be done at the factory, taking it out of the field, because the field is where all of the complications typically happen. You get better quality control in the factory. You can do more things in parallel. So all those really help to reduce construction risk. And for microreactors, even more than any of the other advanced reactors because of their super small size. Some of these are going to be largely constructed in a factory, and there's going to be almost no on-site construction. Others will have more on-site construction. But the other thing we're doing is we're trying to learn from the past, what we've done well and what we've not done well. We actually have built nuclear projects on time, on budget, not just Koreans and Japanese, but also in the US. So we can do it. And so we're learning what we did right and what we did wrong, why for each, and we're putting it into a construction best practices body of knowledge and helping the next projects be able to learn from that and implement them in their projects so that they can replicate the good stuff and avoid the not so good stuff.
Thank you for those questions, Keith. We have a question in the Q&A from Marianne Pease. Given the funding opportunities for microreactors, which programs would be most applicable for rural communities? I think this comes from an understanding that the OCED gave a discourage for microreactor in Nome.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the Nome project, so I can't comment on that. But in terms of funding opportunities for microreactors, there are some out there. So the the federal government passed what's called the CHIPS Act, and while it was mainly for semiconductors, it actually did have some provisions for nuclear. And one of those is funds that would go to states, tribes, universities, basically any organization that was working to develop and deploy an advanced reactor, and it had a broad scope of what could be allowable. We're unfortunately, it hasn't been funded yet, and so we're pushing hard to get that funded. I think overall it would have some $800 million in it, which goes a long way for microreactors. It had another provision in there which would specifically go to universities, actually two provisions to go to universities. One was focused more on research capabilities, and the other was really focused on microreactors at universities. Again, those provisions haven't been funded yet, so we're pushing on that. I have low chance of probability that it'll get into the FY24, but we'll continue to push on that. We're also pushing on a program, and we're promoting a program that is, not going to be ready anytime soon, but it's basically a microreactor demonstration program, just like we have the advanced reactor demonstration program that's funding X Energy and TerraPower. DOE positioned that program really to focus on grid scale technologies, and so we're promoting that are pushing for the government to create a microreactor version of that, which would give funds to those companies. Again, not yet available. There are other things that are readily available, but they generally fall into the loan program office, and so it's loan guarantees and those sorts of things, which certainly help. But it's not exactly some of the direct. It's not a direct funding, and so it may not be exactly what the question was asking for. But those are available.
Thank you. Another question through our Q&A. Could you please confirm that your figure 6 include cost of capital?
Yeah, let me go back to figure 6. So would it be in the report, or was it in my presentation? Figure, I'm just going, oh, I see. Okay, it was the first figure this one. Yes, it includes cost of capital. Yes.
Excellent, thank you. So unless there are other questions from our task force members or the I'll give our Q&A a chance to catch up if there are any remaining questions there, but I do have one question for you, Mark. What market factors do you anticipate will influence the cost of microreactors into the future? When I think of this, I understand that there are some concerns about the supply chain for fuel, the availability going forward for helium in gas-cooled reactors. Do you have any sense of how that will impact cost competitiveness going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question, and actually you touched on the thing that I forgot to mention, because I promised that these were 2019 numbers, and I promised to say, well, what does it mean in 2023? So a couple of things. One is that when we put these numbers together, the microreactor cost, in many ways, we tried to be conservative. So I think if we reran these numbers today, those costs would actually trend closer to the lower range than the higher range. So I think that was a good thing. The other is that we see diesel costs increasing. So the comparison, diesel fuel prices are going up. So the business case is getting a little bit better on those two. Now, the other thing is we're seeing a lot of inflation. This gets to your question across the economy, but especially in the energy sector, and it showed up recently in the UAMPS project. They had estimated their costs, and then they did a refresh at the beginning of the year, and their costs went up considerably. Now, that was a more mature cost estimate. And on the bright side, when they went to the more mature cost estimate, the underlying bases for cost, which are the volume of materials and the number of labor hours, held relatively consistent. And so that's a positive thing. The thing that was mostly contributing to the increase in cost was the higher inflation and higher interest rates. And high inflation is a real significant impact on costs. So while, if we did it in 2019 numbers, we would probably trend toward the bottom range. If we updated it for 23 numbers, it would be pushing that bottom range up quite a bit. So we do want to go back to try to refresh these numbers to have them up to date. The one thing I'll say, though, is this is my perspective, that we're in a period where it's going to be a little bit hard from a public policy, general information basis to gauge different costs between technologies, because some will have refreshed and incorporated that inflation, and others will not yet have done that before. And so you're not really going to be comparing dollars in the same years, which usually if we've got 2% inflation, it doesn't matter. But some of these inflation numbers, we're talking about like 40% jump in prices over just 2 years. And so it does have significant impacts. But the important thing to know is that it's not just microreactor costs that are impacted by inflation. It's everybody else, renewables, natural gas. It's just an energy impact, not a nuclear specific impact. Now, in terms of specific things for microreactors, there we start to get into competition for, I'll say, rare materials. So things like helium or graphite or copper, all those things that are in high demand but low supply, which are the ones we saw a lot of the inflation with. Those are going to be the ones that are going to be challenging. Personally, I tend to think we'll be able to get access to the materials. The question is going to be the cost. So really that could be a consideration people look at as well. For nuclear, what's the number of critical minerals or rare resources that you have compared to other technologies is sort of a risk measurement type of thing.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions, I'd like to thank you again, Mark, for your presentation and answering all the questions you did. For our next presentation, we have Gwen Holdman with ASEP. Along with many other accolades, Gwen is the Associate Vice Chancellor of Research at UAF, sorry, typo in my script, and Senior Researcher at ASEP, where she's currently focusing on energy policy and planning and small-scale nuclear energy. Gwen is also the co-lead of the Alaska Nuclear Energy Working Group with me. Gwen will be doing a wrap-up for our presentations today, presenting on the window of opportunity for Alaska and some interesting public perception results from a recent poll that ASEP conducted. Gwen, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rochelle. Can you guys hear me okay? Great. And Mark, I have like about 50 questions for you myself. So at some point in time, maybe we'll have to catch up on the phone. But I do really share your interest in potentially updating some of those numbers. I'm really interested to see how some of these federal opportunities also sort of move the needle on some of these things in terms of cost comparisons and such. So anyhow, that being said, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hang on one second, I'm sorry. Apologies.
No worries.
All right, there we go. Let me make that full screen. There we go. Okay. All right. Does that look good?
That's good. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So like Rochelle said, I'm just gonna super quickly give a little bit of context, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about these Alaskan perceptions, these poll results that we have specific to nuclear energy, and then just talk a little bit about what this all means for Alaska, or like what kind of strategy that we might be able to consider for the state when it comes to nuclear deployments. So just quickly, I'd say, the University of Alaska in general, working with Rochelle, we've had a really fantastic partnership around nuclear energy. And these are some of the things that we've been doing, putting out reports. I've probably been working on this technology for about 15 years in the state. We've been working on helping shape policy. We've been doing a lot of outreach, public engagements. As Rochelle mentioned, we're co-hosting the Nuclear Energy Working Group. The next meeting that's coming up on, I think September 12th, we'll have Caleb Brooks from the University of Illinois, who's going to be talking about their microreactor project. Mark kind of mentioned a lot of these projects are centered on universities. And then we've been more and more starting to get involved with research with other universities and industry. This bottom slide on the left here is one example that Rochelle and I are both working on, this environmental justice and equity framework for citing nuclear energy in Alaska's Arctic. We're working with the Northwest Arctic Borough, with NOAA, and with Kotzebue on that project. All right, so I'm just going to jump right into this poll, perceptions on nuclear. This was a multimodal, like a pretty formal poll of 700 registered voters. We oversampled Fairbanks specifically because of a lot of the outreach work that we've been doing here related to the Eielson reactor project. And it was weighted to represent Alaska's electorate, was completed by phone this spring. And then there's a standard kind of margin of error higher for Fairbanks because of the lower lower number, total number. So here's just kind of some general factors. And so this one, when it comes to whether folks have actually heard about microreactors or advanced reactors, but microreactors in particular, about 3/4 of people had either heard nothing or very little about them. And so so that was a little bit surprising. Only 25% had heard some or a lot about microreactors, and that was fairly consistent across the state. Fairbanks was a few points higher, but not very much. And so so that just shows that there's still a big part of the Alaskan public that just really isn't tracking or is not aware of this technology, especially as how it differentiates from more legacy or conventional nuclear energy. So basically, one of the findings was really that without additional information, just when we said, are you supportive of nuclear energy as an option for Alaska, the support was pretty low, especially when we compared that to other energy technologies. It was about 48% total, 27% strongly supported it. Then we went ahead and gave them a paragraph. I'll actually just pull this up here. That we tried to make be pretty neutral, but gave a little bit additional information on what a nuclear microreactor is, in terms of how we're defining it, how large it is, in the context of, things that people can understand. And then a few other factors, like the fact that they don't require water for cooling and things like that. And then we asked them again, what their perception was, and the change to support was quite high. It was 26%. So, what that would indicate is that there's still a lot of people that just don't know enough about the technology to really have a truly informed position on it. You can also see, though, there's about 10% that strongly oppose nuclear energy, including these microreactors. And I don't have this slide here, but it actually does show that this is really, really consistent across all political affiliations, whether Republican or Democrat or unaffiliated. It's pretty similar. There's not a big difference in terms of either support or concerns about nuclear. And so when we looked at this kind of the shift, this change, these kind of show some of the demographics in terms of where people sit. So I actually think I did actually have this. So those, for example, that had heard of microreactors before didn't change very much in terms of their opinion. There was like a 9% shift. But those who had not heard of microreactors before, they shifted their position by 31%. So that was where a lot of that shift happened. Like I said, the the column here showing the final support for microreactors was pretty similar across all demographics, but the portion that shifted the most was that kind of that Democrat component or independent component when they had additional information about it. So I think that this question was could have been maybe presented a little bit better, but we did ask voters what concerns they had when it comes to nuclear energy. And I think that the flaw that we had here is that we didn't really ask them to either rank it or pick their top three. And so, there's a lot of people who just basically were like all of the above, right? So basically, but the biggest, concern in general was this question around contamination and waste disposal. And then behind that was safety to communities, security of fuel line, cost, and environmental impacts for mining. And so when you looked at, sorry about that. All right. I'm gonna come back to that in a second. So messaging, when we looked at messaging of microreactors, we basically created two different statements related to microreactors, and then asked respondents to indicate which statement comes closer to their own view, even if neither one of them is, perfectly indicative of exactly their perspective, which one comes closer. And then you can see here that the more positive perception was shared by a greater percentage of respondents. So in this case, about 57%, and 30% responding that it's an unproven technology that poses safety risks and that they're expensive to build and operate. So when we looked at these perceptions, again, this is the one I wanted to show earlier. These were largely nonpartisan, but you can kind of see here the percentage of people that say that we should explore nuclear, and that was sort of the first comment in the previous slide. Those that had heard of microreactors previously, there was 73% of them felt that Alaska should explore developing microreactors as part of its future energy mix. And so you can also see that those that were opposed and stuck with that opinion, about 60%, there was a very big swing toward that it's an unproven technology, and that's almost exactly the same. Here you can see again, the differences between political affiliation are actually pretty small in terms of those that are opposing and those that are supporting this direction. So I'm going to just switch tracks here just a little bit and just mention a couple of different factors to consider when we're looking at nuclear energy just in general for the state of Alaska. First of all, the Senate Bill 194 was passed a couple years ago. In the meantime, Department of Environmental Conservation has developed regulations related to siting small reactors. There's basically a carve out as a category of these small advanced reactors, and that really affirms that control over siting decisions, siting authority. This isn't about permitting, this isn't about licensing, but just siting authority is retained by the local body. And so it's a local decision. And so that's something that's important to, I think, consider. This isn't a situation where somebody in Anchorage can tell someone in Nome what they should or shouldn't do with regard to adopting or supporting a nuclear energy project. It's fundamentally a local problem and local decision, and the reason for that is because any potential implications related to deploying a microreactor would fundamentally be local, and so that's one thing to consider. I think Alaska, we've kind of heard a little bit about, I think industry and believes that Alaska is a pretty near ideal early adopter market, especially in rural Alaska where we've got a high cost of energy and Alaska has this need for heat and power. And so there's been a lot of interest from vendors in the state, and we've heard a lot from them in different kinds of venues, in particular through the working group. And so, another factor, at least that I think about a lot, is this sort of risk and benefit associated with being an early adopter. I'll kind of talk about that in a second here. And those risks or those benefits include economic, technological, there's risk around public perception, and then, those kinds of things. So there can be high upside, but there can also be downsides related to being an early adopter. And then I do think that there's a lot of opportunities right now for these state and federal partnerships. And those are some of the questions I actually have for Mark ultimately is, how that sort of plays out. If we're not just looking at these as one of deployments, but we're really looking at this as part of a broader partnership and strategy, whether that's with Department of Defense or others, that's something that I think is an interesting question to explore. And that sort of fits into this final kind of point here about passive or active decision making. I think that Alaska really has a couple of choices to make when it comes to nuclear energy. We can either kind of take a pretty passive approach to that, and individual communities, individual utilities like CVEA, we heard from Travis earlier, can make their own decisions about whether this makes sense as part of their mix. Or we could take a more active approach as a state and say, this is something that we're interested in. How can we actually reduce the cost or streamline deployment by working together and looking at a multi-site deployment? And those are some of the questions I have around the economics of these systems and some of the supply chain line questions as well. So weighing risk and reward for pilot projects, I just kind of thinking about being up here in Fairbanks, spent some time with the Golden Valley board earlier this week. And so as they're sort of thinking through decisions around new technologies and weighing that risk versus reward question, they have experiences like, for example, they installed this Golden Valley battery energy storage system in Fairbanks that's almost 20 years ago now. That was the largest stationary battery. That was the largest battery system anywhere in the world at the time when that was deployed. It was like a first of a kind system. Now there's many, many batteries that are that large or larger that have been deployed around the world. And so at that time, Alaska and Golden Valley were able to kind of benefit from the fact that this was an early demonstration in terms of interest from national labs, in terms of support, including funding and financing for that particular system. On the other hand, they also have the Healy Clean Coal Project, which is also called Healy 2. And so this was an innovative technology that was designed to have cleaner coal project. And that one has plagued Golden Valley with a lot of different problems. And so the board recently voted to actually close down this plant, even though it's younger than Healy, the first Healy plant. And so, sometimes there can be real upside and sometimes there can be downside for looking at being an early adopter. And that's something that we need to have a pragmatic perspective on. I think this is a slide, I didn't change this for nuclear specifically, but this is sort of something that we really think about when we're looking at any kind of intellectual property, developing or deploying new technologies, is sort of this, this sort of kind of evolution that technologies go through, where you have like an initial, like sort of early small scale kind of proof of concept sort of deployment or test in a lab or something like that, but then actually getting that into the field and getting that to full commercialization and full broad use in the private sector. There's sort of this real challenge that companies sometimes go through, like call this value of death, or some call it more positively the bridge to financeability, where you're kind of getting from that proof of concept prototype to like full commercialization of a product. And this is kind of like a murky place. And right now, this is where I feel like microreactor technologies are sort of wandering around in this space in different places in this sort of area here. And so the question kind of becomes for Alaska is like, how do we want to approach this technology? Is this something that we want to really say, hey, we're interested in being an early adopter, and what does that mean, right? If we're an early adopter and we're taking a proactive strategy around nuclear energy adoption, how can we be working with Department of Defense? How can we be working with Department of Energy and other federal stakeholders to say, we're interested in helping shape and co-develop a technology that we think has value for Alaska, but we don't want to take all of the risk, and we certainly don't want to take all of the financial the financial risk associated with these early adopters. And I think a lot of times the way I see it is that everybody's interested in serial number 10 for these reactor designs. People are less interested in serial number 1 through 5 or 1 through 10. And that's really where I think the federal government can step in, Department of Defense and others, to really look at what's the strategy to get to this like nth unit deployment and the nth cost, that Mark was really kind of talking about. Is like the first unit is going to be more expensive, but if we can look at a strategy for deploying a number of them, how do we actually get to that lower cost that I think the industry needs to sort of drive to in order to be viable? So that's one thing that Alaska can be thinking about. One thing I caution against, is that if we just say, let's just take a wait and see attitude, let's just see how these work out, I worry that we are going to be in a position where, as a late adopter, we are not really going to be in a very good position to get that unit number 10 or that unit 10 through 50. Once these are proven commercial, once the economics are well understood, and if those look promising, there's going to be a very long line of potential customers for these sorts of units and these products. And it's going to take a while for the industry to ramp up to be able to really push out multiple or a dozen or whatever of these units a year. That's going to take some time. And so in some ways, like I think that if we decide that we're just going to take a wait and see attitude, we're going to be behind a long line of potential other customers for those like unit number 10 through 100 or something like that. And that just naturally, that kind of puts us into a late adopter path. I don't think that Alaska is going to get a good deal on unit number 10. This is Gwen's personal opinion on this. The third path, which is also sort of this passive pathway, is the idea that there's individual projects happening in Alaska. This is probably likely to be the passive path that's going to happen in Alaska. You've got the Eielson project, where there was an announcement made today about the vendor for that particular project. It's supposed to hopefully come online in 2027, right? NOAA is really interested in pursuing an option around a micro reactor for the port of Nome and for the city there. So there's a few different individual projects. Those won't benefit from economies of scale or working together unless there's some behind the scenes effort for that. So that's another possible path for individual deployments in Alaska. And so one of the things that I think, because this is really geared toward the task force, is that question around, is there a more proactive path that we want to consider for Alaska? Because we do think this could potentially be an important part of our overall energy portfolio in the future. Or do we want to take that kind of wait and see attitude? So I'll just kind of wrap up here with issues or considerations. One thing that the poll really showed is that the public really isn't that well informed about microreactors, and that's something that's a little bit concerning to me. We've made a lot of effort to reach out to the general public, and it's clear that we're still just meeting, just able to really manage to really reach a pretty small subset of the Alaska population, and so that's just something to kind of keep in mind. Utilities, Travis and CVEA was a real exception to this, but most of them are taking a pretty passive approach. We are interested in microreactors, in modular reactors, in nuclear reactors, if they're proven to be commercial and if they make economic sense. That's a pretty prudent and pragmatic approach from the perspective of the utility industry, and that's mostly what I feel like we largely are in terms of thinking about whether to make active decisions about pursuing this or just sitting back and saying when it becomes commercially available, we're interested, right? And then another thing is too, just like one thing, if we're looking at nuclear energy as a potential option, and really this kind of extends a little bit to other advanced technologies too. Sometimes I think that traditional approaches to procurement may not really be optimal for some of these early project deployments. And so, we saw this Eielson Air Force Base, they have gone through this request for proposals process. It has very much looked like procurement of a commercial technology. We'll hear more about that tonight. They have a public meeting that'll be available for anyone to participate in if they're interested in that. There's also been this alternate approach or path that has been that the Army Strategic Capabilities Office has been doing, called Project Pele. I think that was mentioned earlier by Mark briefly, that they've kind of gone through this request for solutions, really working with industry to kind of co-design approaches and co-design a product that works in this case for like, advanced forward operating bases for the military. And so these are some things that I think enable us to really think about, is there a way that Alaska could kind of take a more proactive leadership role in thinking about what nuclear energy could mean for us, and drive that direction more than being passive. And I think that that is where the task force has a role in terms of making some recommendations. So again, the announcement today regarding the Eielson Air Force Base reactor, whether we support it or not, Alaska is going to be at the forefront of this technology, because that will be the first commercial reactor likely to be deployed in the United States, or microreactor. And so again, like last point, lack of coordination right now. I do think that this is an opportunity for the task force, as you're thinking about recommendations, to consider whether there could be a path for more active engagement, active seeking of partnerships around early adoption that might also help us bring some of those costs down that we heard from Mark in terms of those early adopter projects. I'll just leave this as my very last slide. So this is kind of why I personally become interested in small reactors. I have a background in thermal energy, and so that's how I got involved in it in the first place. But I really have found, as I've sort of learned more and more about this technology, that I think it is a good fit for Alaska. I do think it should be part of our conversation. I like the fact that these are modular. They can be placed where we need them to be, unlike a lot of renewables where we're very much dependent on the resource being available. The fact that they can provide heat in addition to power, to me, is really important and really interesting. I do think that it complements other variable renewables well. It's a carbon-free source of energy. I have found that in my exploration of nuclear energy as a whole, and microreactors and modular reactors, that these do, I am convinced that these offer a safer approach with a greatly reduced risk of environmental contamination and safety for communities. Competitive pricing, I put a question mark here, because that is still, the jury's out on that to some extent, and that's why I love having these conversations with Mark, and I appreciate his time to come and speak with us a little bit about the work that he's done on that. I think that too, this long-term certainty of energy cost is another factor, because there's fairly long time between refueling. That gives us more certainty and some insulation against short-term price spikes in terms of fuel costs. And then I think it is a good complement to other existing Alaska, our resource mix, and again, sort of the market that we're in. So I think that's all I've got. I'll end it there. Stop sharing.
Thank you, Gwen.
And if we don't have questions, then I'm going to ask Mark questions.
Well, we still have Mark on the call as well. So I would open the floor up for questions from our task force members, or drop them in the Q&A for either Mark or Gwen. Gwen, while we wait, oh, never mind. Carl has a question. Rather than carbon-free, is it not reasonable to say that, like other renewables, there's a life cycle carbon footprint for nuclear that while small is still real?
I don't know if that was for me or not, but yeah, nuclear does have a carbon footprint. Everything has a carbon footprint. And so, yes, it is small, but real. But if you look at it with compared to other, and I apologize, I didn't have the reference with me. But if you go and you find the total life cycle carbon footprint for nuclear and compare it to other technologies, it's at the bottom with wind. And then solar's a little bit higher than that. And then fossil fuels are obviously much higher. So.
Thanks, Mark. While waiting for folks to type, if they have remaining questions, Gwen, I think the floor is open for you to ask Mark a question.
Perfect. That sounds great. Mark, I mean, first of all, right at the end there, you started talking more about modular nuclear reactors and some of some of those projects that are under development. And I'm kind of curious, like how would you say, you touched on this a little bit, but could you maybe do a little bit of a comparison between sort of the LCOE costs associated with MNRs and then these micro reactors? Could you kind of talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so when we did the cost estimates, they did come out at different levels, and the grid scale advanced reactors were coming in more at grid scale prices that we see in the lower 48, and so which is lower than the micro reactors, which were coming out at the prices that you tend to see. Well, lower than the prices you tend to see in most of Alaska, maybe not the rail belt. And so, I guess the question is what's driving the differences, and it's really the economies of size. So, if you look at even today's reactors, which are 1,000 megawatts, as you shrink down to the 300 megawatts, you're fighting against the loss of economies of size. But what we find is that when you make them smaller, you actually get cost of, I'll just call it safety or simplicity or smallness. And what that means is that when you make it smaller, because you have a smaller heat source, and because one of nuclear signatures is we've got a decay heat source. So we have to continue to cool after you shut down. And so that heat source is much smaller, so it's easier to protect. But also you're able to use natural physics because it's a smaller heat source. And so you simplify the reactor, you can actually eliminate unnecessary systems at that point. So that's the simplicity and the safety and the smallness that go into getting efficiencies that balance out the loss of the size efficiencies. When you start to shrink down really into the microreactor, then you've already gotten a lot of the safety, simplicity, efficiencies. You still get more. But you're continuing to lose the size efficiencies and probably even at a greater rate. And so that's why the costs start to peak back up. And so, there are other things that are possible for microreactors. We talked about the staffing efficiencies that'll help to bring costs down if we're able to fully implement those. And then there's manufacturing efficiencies. As they're much easier to build purpose suit manufacturing facilities that you can crank them out like a conveyor belt or mass production like cars. And that has opportunities we've only begun to think about, as well as advanced manufacturing. And I'm sorry to go on for a long time, but this is one of the things that I think is most exciting about microreactors. I went to Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and they do a lot of advanced manufacturing down there, 3D printing. And so they 3D printed a Navy submersible, which was about the size of a microreactor reactor vessel. And they said when they went to 3D print it, they took what used to be a year or longer to manufacture it, and they did it in like 30-45 days. It used to cost whatever the cost was, and this was 10% of the cost. So if we really bring in 3D printing and other advanced manufacturing, these microreactors really could bust that whole model of the economics of nuclear. And so that's where all of those things have great potential to really drive down these costs in the future. Many of them may not be seen for the first reactors. So we've got to deal with those costs that we've been talking about, but lots of potential.
Awesome. And so Mark, just kind of following up on that, sorry. And Carl, I see your question in here. I'll get to that in a second. But just kind of continuing along that vein, like Carl asked you about figure 6, so I'm going to ask you a little bit more about that too. And so that breakout of, you said that you wrapped the capital costs were included in that figure, but I'm sort of curious in terms of, the operating costs, right, for these kinds of micro reactors and sort of breaking that out from those capital costs. is interesting to me too, especially with some of these earlier demonstrations where you might expect like the potential for some cost sharing around the capital cost, but probably not that long-term O&M. And so do you, how do you view that? Like, how do you see that sort of broken out?
Yeah, so we do have it broken out in the report. If you go to the Appendix A, we've got all the different cost categories broken out. So we do have we operations and maintenance and all of that. And what we did, because for O&M, we knew that there's lots of opportunities, but we also knew that it may be difficult to realize them early on. So we really were conservative, I believe, in our O&M cost estimates, and so we didn't compare them to. In fact, even the overnight capital costs we have in there were 3, 4, 5 times more than the cost that we see for grid scale reactors, and so yeah. So they're in there. We break them out and we talk about them a little bit, but there could be a whole conversation about what goes into, what does maintenance look like, what does operations look like, and actually a lot of it is driven by staffing, but there are other costs certainly in those areas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's because you use those 2000, that you haven't had a chance to kind of update those numbers yet. You didn't really include any of these like federal incentives in those either, did you? Right? Is that? I just want to confirm that.
Yeah, I don't recall doing it. Certainly not in the figure 6 numbers. And I'm looking back through the report right now. Yeah, and I'm not seeing where we actually calculated with and without incentives. The only incentive we would have included was the loan guarantee. But yeah, we didn't include any of the others. Like you've got the IRA now. I should have mentioned that earlier. You've got those tax incentives, which are sizable, especially if you apply an investment tax credit. Because if it's an investment tax credit, 30%. You put it in an energy community, another 10%. You use primarily domestic supply, that's another 10%. You're talking about a 50% cut in the capital cost, which is the primary cost driver for this. And so, yeah, you could see significant reductions.
Yeah, that's I'm really interested in like understanding that a little bit better. And so maybe I could work with you a little bit to see if we could do a little bit of an updated analysis on that, because I feel like that could be a fairly substantive difference in terms of some of your numbers.
Okay,
so,
yeah, we'd be happy to collaborate.
Okay. And then to answer Carl, I dropped the link to the announcement in there. So Oklo was the one that was selected for the Eielson Air Force Base reactor. So
Gwen, your audio and screen froze right after you said Oklo.
Okay. I guess, yeah, that's like, I don't even know what to say about that. So, but the link to the article is in the response. I just typed it in there as the answered part of that question. So, yeah.
Do we have any more questions from attendees? Gwen, any remaining burning questions for Mark?
No, but thank you, Mark. I know how busy you are, and I really appreciate you taking the time to give the presentation. Of course, Travis had to leave us, but thank you very much.
Yeah, anytime. We're a resource, so anytime you need us, we're happy to talk. Yep.
Great.
So with that concludes our agenda today. Thank you all for joining us, and a special extra thank you to Gwen and Mark and Travis for presenting today. As a reminder, the webinar was recorded and presentation slides will be posted on AEA's website. Join us next week, or join ASAP. I won't be here. Thursday, September 7th from 11 a.m. or at 11 a.m. for our final presentation of the Symposium series, RPS and Clean Energy Standards, National Policy Comparisons. And with that, see you next week.